The people who laugh at you when you're nobody are always the most terrified when you become someone they can't ignore. The executive elevator opened with a soft chime that barely echoed across the glass conference room, but somehow the sound cut through every conversation inside Walker Technologies Tower. Claire Bennett kept speaking automatically, her manicured fingers tightening around the presentation remote as 20 pairs of eyes shifted toward the entrance. As you can see, our third-quarter projections suggest. Then she looked up. The words died in her throat. A tall man stepped out of the elevator wearing a charcoal suit, so perfectly tailored it seemed carved onto him instead of worn. Calm gray eyes scanned the room once. Quietly. Without hurry. Without interest. But the moment Claire saw his face, the blood drained from hers so fast she nearly dropped the remote. Ethan Walker. For one impossible second, the city outside the floor-to-ceiling windows disappeared. The conference table disappeared. The executives disappeared. All she could hear was laughter. Old laughter. Sharp teenage laughter bouncing off cafeteria walls 17 years earlier. Ethan walked past the stunned executives with measured steps, the polished leather of his shoes barely making a sound against the marble floor. He looked older now. Stronger. The awkward boy she remembered had vanished beneath years of discipline and quiet power. There was silver at the edge of his dark hair. Confidence in the way he carried silence like armor. But the eyes were the same, cold when hurt. Claire felt her pulse hammer against her ribs. No, this couldn't be happening. Mr. Walker, someone beside her said nervously, standing too quickly and nearly knocking over a coffee cup. Welcome to Grayson Media. Ethan gave a single nod. Nothing more. The room immediately straightened itself around him like gravity had entered the building. Claire stared at the small scar near his jawline and suddenly remembered a rainy afternoon outside Jefferson High School. Ethan standing alone with soaked notebooks pressed against his chest while students whispered behind him. She remembered herself laughing too. God, she remembered exactly what she said. Some people should learn their place. Back then, he had worn thrift store jackets 2 sizes too big. His sneakers had holes near the soles. He always sat in the back row and avoided eye contact like he hoped invisibility could protect him. It never did. Miss Bennett. Ethan's voice pulled her back so abruptly, she almost flinched. Low. Controlled. Not angry. Somehow that made it worse. Claire realized everyone in the room was staring at her now. Waiting. Her throat tightened. Why yes. Ethan glanced briefly toward the presentation screen behind her. Quarterly projections. Marketing growth strategy. Her name in bold letters beneath the company logo. Then his gaze returned to her face for exactly 1 second. One unbearable second. Long enough for recognition to settle between them like smoke. Long enough for Claire to know he remembered everything. But Ethan simply loosened one cufflink and walked to the head of the table. Please, he said calmly. Continue. The room obeyed instantly. Chairs shifted. Papers rustled. Someone coughed nervously near the windows. Claire turned back toward the screen, but the words blurred together. Her hands trembled almost invisibly as she clicked to the next slide. Ethan sat across from her now, silent beneath the reflection of Manhattan's gray skyline. He didn't glare, didn't smirk, didn't expose her. He only listened with the same unreadable expression people wore when looking at strangers in airports. And somehow, that terrified Claire Bennett more than hatred ever could. Claire barely remembered finishing the presentation. The words came out automatically, polished from years of boardrooms and client meetings, but her mind stayed trapped somewhere between the 17th floor of Walker Tower and a crowded high school cafeteria 17 years earlier. Every time she looked toward Ethan, she felt the same cold pressure tighten in her chest. He listened without interruption, one hand resting loosely near a black leather notebook while Manhattan rain streaked quietly across the windows behind him. He had not smiled once since entering the room, not even politely. When the meeting finally ended, executives rushed to shake his hand with nervous enthusiasm. Claire gathered her papers too quickly, nearly bending the corners. Excellent projections, Miss Bennett, said Richard Cole, the company's regional director, loosening his tie as people filtered toward the doors. Mr. Walker clearly values preparation. Claire forced a smile she did not feel. Across the room, Ethan stood beside the windows speaking softly with legal advisors. Calm, focused, untouchable. She watched him adjust the cuff of his watch with precise movements and suddenly remembered another pair of hands. Younger hands. Thin hands with ink stains near the fingertips from fixing old computers after school for extra cash. Ethan Walker had always smelled faintly like library books and rainwater. Claire hated how clearly she remembered that now. Claire. Her assistant Megan appeared beside her carrying a tablet against her chest. You okay? You look pale. I am fine. That is the new owner? Megan whispered carefully, glancing toward Ethan. He is intense. Claire swallowed. You have no idea. Before Megan could respond, Richard's voice echoed across the room again. Miss Bennett, Mr. Walker would like a copy of your campaign analytics sent directly to his office. Claire froze. Ethan did not look at her while Richard spoke. He simply signed a document handed to him by one of the attorneys. Detached. Efficient. Like she was only another employee in another acquisition. Somehow that hurt more than anger would have. Of course, Claire said quietly. The elevator ride down felt suffocating. Silver walls reflected her face from every angle. Composed on the outside. Cracking underneath. She pressed the lobby button twice before realizing it was already lit. Around her, employees whispered excitedly about the acquisition. Did you hear he started with nothing? They say he wrote his first software code in a public library. Apparently, he owns half the tech infrastructure in Boston now. Claire stared at the glowing floor numbers without speaking. 17, 16, 15. The same age they had been when she humiliated him in front of the entire school auditorium. She could still see it perfectly. Jefferson High Scholarship Finals. Ethan standing alone on stage holding handwritten note cards because he could not afford a laptop like everyone else. His sleeve slightly frayed near the wrist. The auditorium lights too bright against his nervous face. Claire and her friends had sat near the front row wearing varsity jackets and effortless confidence. Untouchable teenagers who believed kindness was optional if popularity protected you. Ethan had started speaking about engineering schools and scholarship dreams when someone in the crowd laughed at his shoes. Then another voice joined in. Then another. Ethan's hands shook. The note cards slipped from his fingers and scattered across the stage floor. Silence followed for one brutal second before Claire leaned back in her seat and laughed. Loud enough for everyone to hear. Some people should learn their place. The memory hit so sharply that Claire closed her eyes inside the elevator. She had not thought about that sentence in years. Not really. Back then it felt careless. Stupid. One cruel moment swallowed by hundreds of others. But now she understood something terrifying. Ethan remembered it. The elevator doors opened into the marble lobby. Claire stepped out slowly, heels clicking across polished stone while rain hammered against the glass entrance outside. Across the lobby television screens, financial news anchors discussed Walker Technologies acquiring Grayson Media in a deal worth nearly $4 billion. Ethan's photograph appeared beside the headline. Calm gray eyes. Controlled expression. Self-made billionaire reshaping American tech culture. Claire stopped walking. For $1 billion. The boy everyone mocked for wearing second-hand clothes now owned the building she worked in. A black SUV waited outside beneath the rain. As security opened the rear passenger door for Ethan, he paused briefly near the entrance. For one impossible second, his eyes met Claire's across the crowded lobby. No hatred. No triumph. Just quiet recognition. Then he stepped into the SUV and disappeared into Manhattan traffic, while Claire stood completely still beneath the cold white lobby lights, realizing for the first time in her life that regret could arrive years late and still feel devastating. Claire did not sleep that night. Rain tapped softly against the windows of her apartment, while the city outside glowed in restless shades of red and gold. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw the same thing. Ethan Walker standing at the head of the conference table. Calm. Silent. Untouchable. She sat on the edge of her bed around 2 in the morning, still wearing one gold earring she had forgotten to remove, scrolling through article after article about him on her phone. Walker Technologies began in a one-bedroom apartment in South Boston. Ethan built the first software prototype himself at 23. Rejected by multiple investors before securing a small startup loan. Current estimated net worth, $8.6 billion. Claire stared at the glowing screen while her coffee grew cold beside her. There were photographs of Ethan shaking hands with senators, speaking at technology conferences, standing beside charity foundations supporting low-income students. One headline caught her attention immediately. Walker Foundation expands scholarship program for underprivileged teenagers. Her stomach tightened. Scholarship program. The irony felt unbearable. She clicked the article. The interview showed Ethan seated beneath soft studio lighting, wearing the same controlled expression he carried everywhere now. The interviewer smiled warmly. You have donated nearly $50 million to education programs in the last 5 years alone. Why is that cause so personal to you? Ethan paused before answering. Because intelligence means nothing if humiliation convinces someone they do not belong in the room. Claire stopped breathing for a second. The words were calm, measured, but they landed like stones. She lowered the phone slowly into her lap. Somewhere deep down, she already knew the answer to the question she had been afraid to ask all evening. He never forgot. Morning arrived gray and heavy over Manhattan. By 8:30, Walker Tower buzzed with tension. Employees moved faster, straighter. Entire departments suddenly cared about punctuality now that Ethan Walker occupied the executive floor. Claire stepped into the lobby carrying 2 folders against her chest and immediately noticed the difference. Fresh flowers near reception. New security staff. The giant digital screen above the elevators now displayed a simple sentence in white letters against a black background. Culture shapes performance. She frowned slightly. That had not been there yesterday. Morning, Megan whispered as Claire entered the marketing department. Everybody is panicking. Claire placed her bag beside her desk carefully. Why? Because Ethan Walker apparently spent 3 hours yesterday reviewing internal employee evaluations personally. Megan leaned closer. Richard said he asked why interns use a separate coffee station from executives. Claire blinked. What? Exactly. Megan lowered her voice further. And apparently he was furious after finding out support staff are not allowed in the executive dining area. Claire looked toward the glass offices lining the floor. For years, Grayson Media operated quietly under invisible hierarchies nobody questioned. Senior executives parked on private levels. Assistants entered through separate security lanes during major events. Employees learned quickly which people mattered and which people did not. Suddenly, she remembered Ethan standing alone outside Jefferson, high-holding cafeteria, trays nobody wanted to share a table with. The memory made her chest ache unexpectedly. Before she could answer Megan, an email notification appeared across every monitor in the office simultaneously. Mandatory executive meeting. 11 a.m. attendance required. Conference hall A. A wave of nervous murmurs spread instantly through the department. By 11 o'clock, nearly 200 employees filled the massive conference hall overlooking the Hudson River. Claire sat near the middle row, fingers laced tightly together while low conversations echoed around her. Then the side doors opened. Silence followed immediately. Ethan entered without security, carrying only a slim black folder beneath one arm. No dramatic entrance. No smile. Just quiet authority that made the entire room straighten instinctively. Claire watched him walk onto the stage beneath soft white lights. He looked composed in a dark navy suit with silver cufflinks catching the light whenever he moved. The same boy who once struggled to afford notebooks now owned the building beneath their feet. Ethan rested the folder on the podium but did not open it immediately. Instead, his eyes moved slowly across the audience. Calm. Observant. I did not buy this company because of profit margins, he said finally. His voice carried easily through the silent room. I bought it because culture matters more than numbers. Employees exchanged confused glances. Ethan continued. A company reflects what it tolerates. If people feel invisible here, performance eventually becomes fear. Fear destroys innovation. Claire felt her throat tighten. He spoke without emotion, but every word sounded painfully personal. Ethan glanced briefly toward the back rows where assistants and junior staff usually sat separately during executive meetings. Starting today, those divisions end. The room felt even quieter. No employee in this company will be treated as lesser because of title, income, education, or background. Claire lowered her eyes slowly. Around her, people scribbled notes furiously while Ethan remained calm beneath the city skyline, glowing behind him. Then, for one brief second, his gaze moved across the crowd and landed directly on Claire again. Not angry, not cruel, just steady enough to remind her that some wounds survive long after teenagers grow older. The changes began quietly. That was what unsettled people the most. Ethan Walker did not storm through departments firing executives or making dramatic speeches about reform. He simply noticed things nobody powerful had bothered noticing before. By the end of the week, the reserved executive parking spots outside Walker Tower had disappeared. The private dining room on the 32nd floor became open seating for every employee regardless of position. Human Resources received direct orders to review salary gaps between senior staff and support teams. People whispered constantly now. In elevators, hallways, coffee lines. Some admired him. Others feared him. Claire Bennett did both. She sat alone in her office late Friday evening while the city darkened beyond the windows, trying to focus on quarterly campaign reports she had already reread 3 times. But every floor of the building seemed haunted by Ethan's presence now. Calm footsteps in distant hallways. Quiet meetings behind glass walls. That controlled voice echoing through conference rooms. Around 7:30, Megan stopped by her office carrying a paper bag from the cafe downstairs. "You are still here?" Claire looked up tiredly. "I could ask you the same thing." Megan smiled weakly and placed a cup of coffee beside her desk. "Peace offering. Also, nobody wanted to leave before the new owner tonight." Claire rubbed her temples slowly. "People are acting like he is some kind of myth. Maybe because he kind of is." Megan sat carefully in the chair across from her. "Do you know what I heard today?" Claire already felt exhausted. "Probably." Apparently, he recognized the name of one of the janitors and thanked him personally for working overnight during the server crash last year. Megan shook her head. "Richard Cole has been here 12 years and still calls half the staff by the wrong names." Claire stared quietly at the steam rising from her coffee. Ethan always remembered names. Even in high school, that memory returned unexpectedly. Jefferson High Library. Winter. Ethan helping the elderly librarian carry boxes of donated books, while most students ignored her completely. Claire had passed by laughing with friends on the way to basketball practice. She remembered seeing Ethan kneeling beside a broken cart, quietly reorganizing books no one cared about. Back then, she thought kindness looked weak. Now she was not so sure anymore. "Claire." Megan's voice pulled her back. "You okay?" "Fine. You have looked nervous all week." Claire forced herself to take a sip of coffee. "Just adjusting." Megan hesitated. "Can I ask you something strange?" Claire looked up cautiously. "What?" "When Mr. Walker looks at you," Megan lowered her voice slightly, "it feels like you two know each other." Claire's fingers tightened around the paper cup instantly. For one dangerous second, she almost told the truth. Instead, she looked back toward the glowing city skyline. "We went to the same school a long time ago." Megan blinked. "Seriously?" Claire nodded once. "That explains it." "Explains what?" "The tension." Megan gave a nervous laugh. "Every time you are in the same room, it feels like everybody stops breathing." Claire looked away immediately. Before she could answer, her office phone rang sharply across the desk. Both women jumped slightly. Claire reached for the receiver. Claire Bennett speaking. "Miss Bennett." The calm male voice on the other end made her stomach drop instantly. "Ethan, I need the revised campaign projections for the Madison account." Claire straightened automatically in her chair. "Of course. I can send them first thing tomorrow morning. Tonight would be preferable." Silence filled the room for half a second. "I understand." Ethan paused briefly before speaking again. "Bring them to the executive floor personally." The line disconnected softly. Megan stared at her wide-eyed. "Well," she whispered. That sounded terrifying. Claire looked down at the dark computer screen, reflecting her own uneasy face. 40 minutes later, the executive floor stood nearly silent beneath dim evening lights. Most employees had gone home hours ago, leaving only the distant hum of computers and the soft glow of Manhattan outside the towering windows. Claire stepped out of the elevator holding the revised files tightly against her chest. Ethan's office sat at the far end of the hallway surrounded by glass walls overlooking the city. The door stood partially open. She hesitated before knocking softly against the frame. "Come in." Ethan sat behind a massive black desk reviewing documents beneath warm golden lighting. His suit jacket rested neatly across a nearby chair, leaving the sleeves of his white dress shirt rolled once near his wrists. The office smelled faintly of coffee and rain drifting through the cracked window beside him. Claire stepped inside carefully. The revised projections. Ethan accepted the folder without looking up immediately. Silence stretched between them while he reviewed the first pages with focused attention. Claire suddenly became hyper-aware of everything. The ticking clock on the wall, rain tapping softly against glass, her own heartbeat. Finally, Ethan closed the folder gently and looked at her for the first time all evening. "Your work is good," he said calmly. Claire blinked slightly. "Thank you." Ethan studied her for a quiet moment that felt far too long. Then he asked the question she had feared all week. "Do you ever think about high school, Claire?" The question settled between them like smoke in still air. Claire felt her throat tighten instantly. Outside the office windows, rain blurred the Manhattan skyline into soft streaks of silver and gold, but inside Ethan Walker's office, everything felt painfully sharp. The ticking clock, the faint scent of coffee, the calm expression on his face as he waited for her answer. Claire forced herself to breathe evenly. "Sometimes," she said quietly. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, studying her with unreadable eyes. "Only sometimes." Claire looked down at the folder in her hands because meeting his gaze suddenly felt impossible. Not enough, apparently. Silence followed. Ethan did not rush to fill it. He had become someone comfortable with silence now. That unsettled her more than anger ever could. Back in high school, silence around Ethan used to feel awkward. Lonely. The silence now felt controlled. Powerful. Claire finally looked up again. "You remember that day?" It was not a question. Ethan's expression barely changed. People remember moments that teach them who they are. The words landed softly, but Claire felt them anyway. She wrapped her fingers tighter around the edge of the folder. "Ethan," he raised one hand slightly, stopping her before she could continue. "Not cruelly. Just enough. You do not owe me an apology tonight." Claire blinked in surprise. "I do not." Ethan stood slowly from behind the desk and walked toward the window overlooking the rain-soaked city streets nearly 40 floors below. No, his reflection shimmered faintly against the glass. Because apologies usually come from people trying to feel better about themselves. Claire stared at him quietly. The boy she once mocked had learned how to speak. With surgical precision. Every sentence calm enough to sound kind. Honest enough to hurt anyway. Ethan loosened his cufflinks carefully before speaking again. "Do you know what I remember most about high school?" Claire swallowed. "What?" "Not the laughter." He looked down at the streets below. "Not even the humiliation." His voice remained steady. "I remember how easy it was for everyone." Claire felt something heavy settle in her chest. Ethan turned toward her again. Nobody thought twice about making someone feel invisible. She opened her mouth, then stopped herself. Because he was right. Back then, cruelty had not even felt cruel. It felt normal. Popular students laughed. Other students joined in. Teachers ignored things that did not leave bruises. Claire remembered Ethan eating lunch alone beside the gym staircase, while groups of students passed without seeing him at all. She remembered hearing rumors about his mother working double shifts at a nursing home. About Ethan repairing old computers on weekends for grocery money. She remembered knowing all of that, and still laughing anyway because it was easier to belong to the crowd than question it. Ethan walked back toward the desk slowly. "I spent years thinking success would erase those memories." His tone stayed calm, but something quieter moved beneath it now. "Tiredness, maybe." "It does not." Claire looked at him carefully. "Is that why you bought this company?" For the first time, Ethan almost smiled. Not warmly, more like someone recognizing a difficult truth. "Partly." He rested one hand against the edge of the desk. "When I reviewed Grayson Media before the acquisition, I noticed patterns." Claire frowned slightly. Patterns. Executives treated support staff like furniture. Junior employees were afraid to speak in meetings. Interns were ignored unless they became useful. Ethan's gray eyes met hers steadily. "It reminded me of Jefferson High." Claire looked away immediately. The rain outside grew heavier, tapping softly against the glass walls surrounding the office. Ethan remained quiet for a moment before asking, "Do you know what changed my life?" Claire shook her head slowly. Ethan glanced toward the city lights again. "One teacher." Claire looked surprised. "Mrs. Holloway." His voice softened slightly for the first time all evening. "Computer science teacher. She saw me fixing broken library computers after school and told me I was wasting time hiding in the back row." Claire remembered her vaguely. Older woman, always carrying stacks of papers and coffee mugs through the hallway. Ethan continued quietly. "She helped me apply for coding programs. Stayed after school 3 nights a week teaching me programming because I could not afford private classes." Claire listened without speaking. "One person decided I mattered," Ethan said. That was enough. The office fell silent again. Claire felt ashamed of how little she had ever wondered about Ethan after graduation. In her mind, he had simply disappeared. But now she realized something painful. While she moved forward comfortably through college internships and corporate promotions, Ethan had rebuilt himself from humiliation and exhaustion one sleepless night at a time. Finally, Claire spoke carefully. "I was awful to you." Ethan did not answer immediately. He simply adjusted the sleeve of his shirt slowly, thoughtfully. "You were 17, he said at last. Claire shook her head faintly. "That is not an excuse." Ethan studied her for a long moment beneath the soft office lighting. Then he said something that made her chest tighten even more. "No, but it might be a reason." Claire stared at him silently, while thunder rolled softly somewhere beyond the city skyline. And for the first time since Ethan Walker walked back into her life, she realized he was not trying to punish her at all, which somehow felt far more difficult to survive. After that night, something inside Claire Bennett changed quietly. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough that she started noticing things she had spent years walking past without seeing. Monday morning arrived cold and clear over Manhattan. Employees flooded through Walker Tower carrying coffee cups and glowing phone screens, while taxi horns echoed faintly below the skyscrapers. Claire stepped into the lobby just after 8 and immediately paused. Near the reception desk, Ethan Walker stood speaking with one of the overnight janitors. The older man looked nervous at first, twisting his cleaning gloves in rough hands weathered by decades of work. But Ethan listened carefully, nodding once or twice while the man explained something about maintenance schedules. Then Ethan smiled slightly and shook his hand before heading toward the elevators. The janitor stood frozen afterward like he could not quite believe what had happened. Claire watched the entire interaction from across the lobby. No cameras, no executives nearby, no performance, just respect given naturally. That unsettled her more than any speech ever could. Upstairs, the marketing floor buzzed with new tension. Rumors spread faster every day now. Ethan had reduced executive bonuses to expand employee healthcare coverage. He approved tuition assistance for interns pursuing night classes. He ordered managers to attend anonymous workplace reviews where junior employees could speak honestly without punishment. Some executives admired the changes publicly while privately resenting every one of them. Claire noticed Richard Cole especially. The regional director smiled whenever Ethan appeared nearby, but frustration tightened his face afterward. Around noon, Claire entered the executive dining area carrying files for a client review and stopped short near the doorway. Ethan sat alone by the windows eating soup from a plain ceramic bowl while reading reports on a tablet. No private table, no assistants hovering nearby, just quiet concentration beneath the pale winter sunlight pouring through glass walls. Claire almost turned around before he noticed her. "Miss Bennett." She froze automatically. Ethan lowered the tablet slightly. "You can sit if you want." Claire hesitated. "I do not want to interrupt." "You are not." The dining room remained nearly empty at that hour except for a few interns eating nervously near the back corner. Claire crossed the room slowly and sat across from him, smoothing her skirt carefully beneath the table. For a moment neither spoke. The city skyline stretched endlessly behind Ethan in shades of steel blue and silver. Finally Claire glanced toward his lunch with faint surprise. "That is all you eat?" Ethan looked down briefly at the soup. "Most days." "You own half of Boston." Ethan almost smiled again. "And yet tomato soup still costs $6. Claire let out a small laugh before she could stop herself. The sound surprised both of them slightly. Ethan rested his spoon beside the bowl. "You seem less afraid of me today." Claire looked down at her hands quietly. "Maybe because I realized something." "What?" She met his eyes carefully. "You are not trying to hurt me." Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair. "No, even though you probably could." Silence followed for a second. Then Ethan answered honestly. "Hurting people gets exhausting after a while." Claire studied him carefully beneath the soft restaurant lighting. "Was that what happened to you?" Ethan's gaze shifted briefly toward the windows. "For a long time, yes." Claire frowned slightly. Ethan folded his hands together loosely. "When you spend enough years feeling humiliated, eventually you start wanting power just so nobody can do it again." His voice remained calm, but the honesty inside it felt heavy. That can become dangerous if you are not careful. Claire thought about the executives downstairs already terrified of disappointing him. The billionaire newspapers called ruthless during negotiations. the man who now controlled thousands of careers with a signature. Yet somehow Ethan still treated janitors with more dignity than most executives treated assistants. "So what changed?" she asked softly. Ethan looked at her directly then. "I met people who had every reason to become cruel and chose not to." Claire lowered her eyes slowly. She wondered if Ethan knew how impossible it was becoming to reconcile the boy she remembered with the man sitting across from her now. Back in high school, she had believed weakness and kindness belonged together. Ethan had destroyed that illusion without ever raising his voice. Before either could continue, Richard Cole entered the dining room, speaking sharply into his phone. The moment he noticed Claire sitting with Ethan, surprise flashed across his face. "Mr. Walker," Richard said quickly, ending the call. "The investors from Chicago arrived early." Ethan nodded once and stood smoothly from the table. "I will be there in 5 minutes." Richard glanced briefly toward Claire with poorly hidden curiosity before leaving again. Ethan gathered his tablet calmly. Claire stood too. "Thank you for lunch." Ethan adjusted the sleeve of his coat. "It was soup, Claire." She smiled faintly despite herself. But as Ethan started walking toward the exit, he stopped beside her for one brief moment and said quietly, "You know, the strange thing about memory is that sometimes the people who hurt us are also the ones who help us understand who we never want to become." Then he walked away beneath the pale winter sunlight, while Claire remained standing beside the table, staring at the untouched coffee cooling slowly between her trembling hands. Snow began falling over Manhattan the following Thursday evening, soft white flakes drifting past the glass walls of Walker Tower, while most employees hurried home before traffic worsened. Claire Bennett remained at her desk long after sunset, reviewing campaign revisions nobody had actually requested yet. The truth was simpler than overtime. Going home meant silence. And lately silence gave her too much time to think about Ethan Walker. Around 8:15, the marketing floor finally emptied completely except for the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Claire rubbed her tired eyes and stood slowly, gathering files into neat stacks before shutting down her computer. As she reached for her coat, she noticed lights still glowing beneath the glass doors of the executive conference room down the hallway. She hesitated. Then curiosity pulled her forward before caution could stop her. The conference room overlooked the river, its massive windows reflecting snowfall against the dark water below. Ethan sat alone at the far end of the table, surrounded by open reports and handwritten notes. His tie had been loosened slightly, and the sleeves of his white shirt were rolled neatly near his wrists again. A single lamp illuminated the room in warm gold, while the rest of the floor remained shadowed and quiet. Claire almost stepped away. Before Ethan glanced up, "You are still here." His voice sounded softer tonight somehow. Maybe exhaustion made honesty easier. Claire held her coat closer against herself. "So are you." Ethan closed one of the reports calmly. "Occupational hazard." She smiled faintly despite herself. "Being a billionaire? Being responsible for 7,000 employees." Claire leaned lightly against the doorway. "That sounds heavier." Ethan nodded once. "It usually is." Snow drifted quietly beyond the glass while the city lights below blurred into silver reflections across the river. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Claire noticed an old leather notebook resting beside Ethan's laptop. The edges looked worn from years of use. Ethan followed her gaze briefly. "You can come in, Claire. I am not conducting a secret meeting." She stepped inside carefully, heels soft against the carpeted floor. Up close, Ethan looked more tired than usual tonight. Faint shadows beneath his eyes, the kind earned through years of sleeping too little and carrying too much. Claire stopped near the table. "You really work all the time, do you not?" Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair. "Most people do when they are afraid of losing everything." Claire frowned softly. "You still think like that?" Ethan's eyes drifted toward the snowfall outside. "When you grow up watching bills pile on kitchen counters, part of you never stops preparing for disaster." Claire looked down quietly. She remembered hearing rumors back in high school that Ethan's family had their electricity shut off twice one winter. She never cared enough to ask if it was true. Ethan noticed her expression. "You do not have to look guilty every time we talk." Claire gave a weak smile. "I am trying not to." Ethan studied her for a moment before opening the leather notebook beside him. "Do you want to see something strange?" Claire stepped closer carefully. Ethan turned the notebook toward her. Inside were pages filled with handwritten ideas, sketches, programming notes, and business plans dating back years. Some pages looked almost worn thin from being reread repeatedly. Claire flipped carefully through the notebook until one folded piece of paper slipped loose near the center. Ethan's expression changed slightly. I forgot that was still there. Claire unfolded the paper slowly, then froze. It was an old Jefferson High Scholarship application essay. The paper looked yellowed with age now, but she recognized Ethan's careful handwriting instantly. Her eyes moved across the first lines. I want to build places where people are valued for what they contribute, not what they wear or where they come from. Claire felt her throat tighten. Ethan watched the snow quietly while she continued reading. Too many intelligent people disappear because humiliation convinces them they are unwanted before they ever get the chance to succeed. The room fell silent except for the faint sound of wind against the windows. Claire lowered the paper slowly. You wrote this when you were 17? Ethan nodded once. The night before the scholarship presentation. Claire stared at him across the conference table. You still kept it? Ethan gave the smallest shrug. It reminded me what kind of company I never wanted to create. Claire looked back down at the essay again. There were small coffee stains near the edges now. Fold marks from years spent carried inside pockets and briefcases. One sentence near the bottom caught her attention immediately. Success means nothing if becoming powerful turns you into the same kind of person who once made you feel worthless. Claire stopped reading. Her eyes blurred suddenly. She looked away before Ethan could notice. But of course he did. Ethan always noticed things. Claire. His voice stayed gentle. She shook her head faintly. I do not understand how you became this person. Ethan remained quiet for a second before answering honestly. I almost did not. Claire looked up slowly. Ethan rested one hand against the notebook. There were years when I wanted revenge more than success. Snow continued falling softly beyond the windows while Manhattan glowed cold and distant beneath the winter sky. Then Ethan said quietly, almost to himself, the hardest part of surviving humiliation is deciding whether you want to heal from it or become it. The first crack appeared the next morning. Claire Bennett arrived at Walker Tower just before 9 carrying 2 coffees and a stack of revised presentation folders. But something in the lobby atmosphere felt wrong immediately. Employees stood in small groups whispering quietly near the elevators. Security guards spoke into radios with tense expressions. The giant digital screens usually displaying company updates had gone dark except for the Walker Technologies logo glowing against black backgrounds. Claire spotted Megan near reception, clutching her phone tightly. What happened? Megan looked pale. Richard Cole. Claire frowned. What about him? Megan lowered her voice. Somebody leaked internal emails overnight. Claire felt her stomach tighten instantly. What kind of emails? Megan swallowed. Bad ones. 10 minutes later, the entire company knew. Anonymous screenshots flooded social media, showing Richard mocking support staff privately with senior executives. Intern applications rejected because candidates looked too poor or unpolished. Cleaning staff described as background maintenance. Scholarship applicants from low-income schools dismissed as bad for corporate image. The outrage spread through the building like electricity. Claire sat frozen at her desk, scrolling through the messages while employees moved anxiously around her. One screenshot made her chest ache unexpectedly. Richard writing to another executive months earlier. People from those backgrounds should stay realistic about where they belong. Claire stared at the sentence until the words blurred together. Ethan's old scholarship presentation echoed painfully in her memory. Some people should learn their place. History repeating itself through different mouths. Different suits. Same cruelty. Around noon, an emergency executive meeting was announced. The conference hall filled faster than Claire had ever seen before. Employees packed every seat while tension hung heavy beneath the bright overhead lights. Then Ethan Walker entered. Calm as always. No anger visible on his face. Somehow that made the room even quieter. Richard Cole sat near the front row sweating through his expensive gray suit while legal advisors lined the side walls holding folders against their chests. Ethan walked onto the stage slowly and rested both hands against the podium. This morning, he said evenly, many of you saw internal communications that do not reflect the values this company claims to represent. Silence swallowed the room. Richard avoided eye contact completely now. Ethan continued calmly. The easiest thing for leadership to do in moments like this is protect itself. His gray eyes moved steadily across the audience. I am not interested in easy leadership. Claire watched employees straighten quietly in their seats. Ethan did not raise his voice once. He never needed to. Walker Technologies was built on one principle, he said. No human being should feel small simply because they entered the wrong room. Claire felt her throat tighten instantly. Ethan glanced briefly toward Richard before continuing. Effective immediately, Richard Cole is no longer employed by this company. A ripple of stunned whispers spread across the hall. Richard stood abruptly. Mr. Walker, this is completely unfair. Those emails were private conversations taken out of context. Ethan looked at him steadily. Context does not improve contempt. The room fell silent again. Richard's face flushed dark red. You are humiliating me publicly. For the first time all afternoon, something flickered behind Ethan's calm expression. Not anger. Recognition. No, he said quietly. I am holding you accountable publicly. There is a difference. Claire lowered her eyes slowly. The words landed heavily because she knew Ethan understood humiliation better than anyone in the room. Richard gathered his papers shakily while security approached near the side aisle. Before leaving, he looked bitterly toward Ethan. You think kindness makes you strong? Ethan's expression never changed. No, I think insecurity makes people cruel. Richard left without another word beneath the weight of hundreds of silent eyes. The conference hall remained perfectly still afterward. Ethan looked across the employees seated before him. Assistants, executives, interns, receptionists, people who spent years invisible inside buildings exactly like this. 1. Listen carefully, he said softly. Success does not give anyone permission to disrespect others. His gaze moved slowly through the room until it landed unexpectedly on Claire again. And intelligence means nothing if it comes without humanity. Claire felt heat rise behind her eyes immediately. Ethan looked away before anyone else noticed. After the meeting ended, employees filed quietly into the hallways carrying shaken expressions and whispered conversations. Claire stayed seated longer than everyone else, staring at the empty podium beneath the conference lights. She finally understood something painful. Ethan had spent years becoming powerful enough to destroy people like Richard Cole. Instead, he became the kind of man who protected people from becoming Richard Cole. That required a different kind of strength entirely. Later that evening, Claire found herself alone near the executive elevators while snow drifted softly outside the glass entrance below. She heard footsteps behind her and turned slowly. Ethan approached carrying his coat over one arm, exhaustion visible around his eyes again. For a second, neither spoke. Then Claire asked quietly, "Was that hard for you?" Ethan paused beside her beneath the pale elevator lights. "What part?" "Watching someone become exactly what once hurt you." Ethan looked toward the snowfall beyond the lobby windows. His reflection shimmered faintly against the glass. "The hardest part," he said quietly, "is realizing how easy it would have been to become that person myself." Winter settled fully over Manhattan by December. Snow gathered quietly along sidewalks outside Walker Tower, while warm yellow lights glowed behind the massive glass walls of the building each evening. Inside, something had changed too. Not suddenly, not perfectly, but enough for people to feel it. Interns spoke more during meetings now. Receptionists no longer lowered their eyes when executives passed by. Employees from different departments sat together in the dining area without invisible lines separating who belonged where. Claire Bennett noticed all of it. She noticed security guards laughing more easily in the lobby. Junior assistants offering ideas without fear in conference rooms. She noticed Ethan Walker greeting people by name no matter their title. Most of all, she noticed how carefully he protected the kind of people the world usually ignored. One snowy evening near Christmas, Claire remained late again finishing campaign revisions while soft jazz music drifted quietly through the nearly empty office floor. Outside the windows, the city looked blurred beneath falling snow and golden streetlights. She gathered her files slowly before noticing a small envelope resting on her desk. No name outside, just cream-colored paper folded neatly beneath the lamp glow. Claire frowned slightly and opened it carefully. Inside was a handwritten note in Ethan's unmistakably precise handwriting. Roof. 10 minutes. Her heartbeat quickened immediately. 10 minutes later, Claire stepped onto the rooftop terrace wrapped tightly in her wool coat as cold wind swept gently across the skyline. Snowflakes drifted through the city lights like falling ash, while distant traffic hummed somewhere far below. Ethan stood near the edge of the terrace overlooking Manhattan, hands resting inside the pockets of his dark overcoat. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence between them no longer felt sharp now, just honest. Claire stepped beside him slowly. You summoned me to the roof in a snowstorm. Ethan glanced toward her briefly. It sounded dramatic in my head. Claire laughed softly under her breath. The sound disappeared into the winter air between them. Ethan looked back toward the skyline. Tomorrow is the holiday board dinner. Claire nodded. I know. You are receiving a promotion. She turned toward him in surprise. Ethan remained calm beside her. Senior Vice President of Brand Strategy. Claire blinked. Ethan, you earned it. Snow settled quietly against the shoulders of his coat, while the city glowed beneath them in silver and gold. Claire swallowed carefully. Some people will think you only promoted me because of, she hesitated. Because of our history. Ethan's expression stayed unreadable for a moment. Then he answered softly. Most people spend too much time worrying about appearances instead of truth. Claire looked down at the snowy rooftop beneath her heels. The truth is I treated you horribly. Ethan remained quiet. I was cruel because it was easy, she admitted. Her breath fogged faintly in the cold air. And because I wanted people to like me more than I wanted to be kind. Ethan watched the falling snow without interrupting. Claire's voice softened further. I have replayed that day in my head 1,000 times since you came back into my life. Ethan finally turned toward her slowly. Claire. She shook her head faintly. No. Let me say this properly. Her fingers tightened around the edge of her coat. You spent years building yourself into someone extraordinary after people tried to make you feel invisible. Her eyes glistened beneath the rooftop lights. And I helped them do it. Silence followed. Only wind moving softly through the skyline around them. Ethan looked at her for a long moment before speaking. Do you know something strange? Claire waited quietly. Ethan's gray eyes reflected the lights of the city below. For years I imagined this moment differently. She frowned slightly. How? A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. In my imagination, becoming successful felt like winning. Claire stared at him silently. Ethan looked out across Manhattan again. But eventually I realized success does not heal humiliation. Snow landed softly in his dark hair before melting away. It only gives you the opportunity to decide what kind of person you become afterward. Claire felt tears threaten behind her eyes again. Ethan turned fully toward her then, calm and steady beneath the falling snow. I forgave you a long time ago, he said quietly. Not because what happened did not matter, but because I did not want my future controlled by the worst moment of my past. Claire looked down immediately, emotion tightening painfully in her chest. Ethan reached into his coat pocket and handed her a folded document. She opened it slowly. At the top was the company's new official mission statement. No one here is beneath respect. Claire stared at the sentence while snow drifted around them in silence. Ethan's voice came softly beside her. I built this company for people like the boy I used to be. Claire looked up at him carefully. Ethan smiled faintly then. Tired, honest, human, and maybe, he said quietly, for the people still learning how to become better too. Far below them, Manhattan glowed endlessly beneath the winter night, while two people stood side by side in the silence, no longer trapped by who they had once been. And for the first time in 17 years, Claire Bennett finally understood that real power was never about making others feel small. It was about becoming someone who no longer needed to.